Every civilization believes it's different. Every generation swears their money is real, their system is stable, their future is secure. And every single time, without exception, they're proven catastrophically wrong. From ancient Mesopotamia to modern Venezuela, from the Spanish Empire to the Soviet Union, the pattern never changes. Empires rise on promises and collapse on broken faith. Currency isn't permanence, it's permission. And that permission can be revoked in a heartbeat. The question isn't whether your money will fail. History has already answered that. It will. The question is whether you'll see it coming, whether you'll understand the signs everyone else ignores, and whether you'll hold something real when the illusions finally shatter. Because here's what they don't teach you in school. Every major civilization in human history has destroyed its own money. Not through war, not through conquest, but through the quiet, deliberate act of betraying trust. And when it happens, when the banks close and the currency dies, survival doesn't belong to the faithful. It belongs to the skeptics. The Spanish Empire, when silver turned to dust. In the 1500s, Spain was unstoppable. Conquistadors had discovered the New World, and with it, mountains of silver. Literal mountains. The mines of Potosi in modern-day Bolivia produced more silver than anywhere else on Earth. Ships sailed from the Americas loaded with treasure, and Spain became the wealthiest empire the world had ever seen. For decades, Spanish silver coins circulated across Europe, Asia, and Africa. They were the global currency, accepted everywhere, trusted by everyone. Spain's king could fund armies, build palaces, and wage wars across continents. The empire seemed eternal, blessed by God and backed by infinite wealth. But here's the trap that catches every empire. Wealth isn't the same as production. Spain had silver, but it didn't make anything. It imported everything: food from France, textiles from the Netherlands, weapons from Germany.
The silver flowed in from the mines and immediately flowed back out to pay for goods Spain couldn't produce itself. Worse, the flood of silver caused something economists now call the price revolution. When you double the money supply without doubling the goods, prices explode. Bread that cost 1 silver coin in 1500 cost 8 coins by 1600. Spanish workers watched their wages buy less and less while foreign merchants grew rich selling to Spain at inflated prices. The government, desperate for more revenue, did what governments always do. They debased the currency. They mixed copper with silver, issued coins with less precious metal, and printed paper promises backed by future mines that would never produce enough. Each debasement eroded trust a little more. By the 1640s, Spain was bankrupt, not poor. It still had silver mines, but bankrupt because no one believed its promises anymore. The empire that had once dominated the world couldn't pay its soldiers, couldn't fund its wars, and couldn't feed its people. Spanish currency became a joke across Europe. The survivors of Spain's collapse weren't the ones hoarding Spanish coins. They were the Dutch merchants who had converted Spanish silver into productive assets: ships, factories, trade networks. They were the landowners in France who traded worthless coins for grain and livestock. They were the artisans in Italy who demanded payment in gold, not promises. The lesson is carved into history. Empires that confuse wealth with productivity always collapse. And when they do, the winners are those who understood that real value comes from making things, not just possessing things. The Dutch Tulip Mania, when flowers cost more than houses. Just decades after Spain's silver empire began its descent, something stranger happened in the Netherlands. In the 1630s, a country that had built its wealth on trade, innovation, and hard work went collectively insane over flowers. Tulips, recently imported from the Ottoman Empire, became a status symbol. At first, only the wealthy could afford rare varieties. But then something shifted. People began buying tulip bulbs not to plant gardens, but to sell to the next buyer at a higher price. It wasn't about the flowers anymore. It was about the game. Prices spiraled into madness. A single tulip bulb could cost as much as a canal house in Amsterdam. Workers sold their tools. Merchants sold their ships. Families mortgaged their homes. Everyone believed the same delusion, that prices would keep rising forever, that someone else would always pay more, that this time was different. In February 1637, reality returned with brutal force. At an auction in Harlem, tulip bulbs failed to sell. Buyers simply stopped showing up. Within days, the entire market collapsed. Fortunes evaporated overnight. People who had been wealthy on paper discovered they owned nothing but worthless flowers. The aftermath was devastating. Those who had leveraged everything, borrowed money to buy bulbs, sold real assets to chase the mania, were ruined. But a smaller group of people walked away unscathed. They had watched the madness from the sidelines, refused to participate, and kept their wealth in land, trade goods, and productive businesses. Here's the pattern that repeats across every bubble in history. When an asset's price rises faster than its utility, when people buy not for use but for resale, when everyone insists this time is different, you're watching a tulip mania in slow motion. The names change. Tulips become railroads, railroads become .com stocks become crypto or real estate. But the psychology never does. The survivors of manias aren't the true believers. They're the skeptics who recognize that when everyone is getting rich doing nothing productive, someone is about to lose everything. The Soviet Union, when an empire evaporated overnight. For 70 years, the Soviet Union told its citizens a story. The story was that their system was superior, that their money was stable, that the state would provide forever. Pensions were guaranteed. Jobs were secure. Prices were controlled. And the ruble, while not convertible to Western currencies, was the bedrock of daily life for 300 million people. Then, between 1991 and 1994, that story disintegrated. When the Soviet Union collapsed, it didn't just lose territory. It lost the ability to maintain the fiction that had held its economy together. Suddenly, factories that had produced goods no one wanted couldn't sell anything. State enterprises that had employed millions couldn't pay wages. And the ruble, once the only currency Soviet citizens knew, became worthless paper overnight. Hyperinflation arrived like a plague. In 1992, prices increased by 2,500%. A salary that could feed a family for a month in December couldn't buy bread by January. Pensioners who had worked their entire lives for the state found their savings destroyed. Engineers, doctors, teachers, the educated middle class, were reduced to selling belongings on street corners just to eat. But while millions suffered, a small group of people recognized the opportunity hidden inside the chaos. When the Soviet government privatized state industries, selling them for practically nothing to generate quick cash, these individuals moved fast. They bought factories, oil fields, mines, and resources for a fraction of their value. They understood something crucial. Productive assets retain value even when currency dies. Within a decade, Russia had created a new class of oligarchs. Not through innovation or hard work, but through recognizing that when empires collapse, ownership of real things, energy, metals, land, is the only wealth that survives. For ordinary Russians, the lesson was brutal. Your government's promises are worth exactly nothing when the government itself ceases to exist. Those who had saved rubles lost everything. Those who had access to dollars, gold, or tangible goods survived. And those who understood the transfer of assets from state to private hands became the new elite. This wasn't unique to Russia. The same pattern played out across every former Soviet republic. In Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, everywhere the USSR had controlled, the collapse rewarded those who moved from paper to production, from promises to property, from belief to tangible assets. The pattern is always the same. When the system breaks, proximity to real resources determines survival. Argentina, the endless loop of collapse. If there's one nation that proves currency collapse isn't ancient history, it's Argentina. This is a country that has defaulted on its debt 9 times. 9 times. A country that has watched its currency destroyed, reborn, and destroyed again in endless cycles of inflation, hyperinflation, and desperate monetary experiments. In 1900, Argentina was one of the wealthiest nations on earth, richer than France or Germany. Its beef and grain fed the world. Its cities rivaled London and Paris in sophistication. Economists predicted it would become a global superpower, Instead, it became a case study in how governments can destroy prosperity through monetary manipulation. The pattern began early. Whenever Argentina faced economic difficulty, its government printed money to cover the gap. Print to pay debts, print to fund programs, print to win elections. And every time the same result: inflation that eroded savings, destroyed trust, and pushed the next crisis closer. By the 1980s, Argentina was trapped in hyperinflation. Prices doubled every month. Workers demanded daily wages because their morning paycheck couldn't buy lunch by afternoon. Stores stopped marking prices because they changed hourly. The currency became so worthless that people used it as scrap paper. The government responded with a radical plan: replace the currency entirely. Out went the peso, in came the austral. Problem solved, right? Except they kept printing australs just like they'd printed pesos. Within a few years, hyperinflation returned. So they tried again. Out went the austral, back came the peso. A new peso pegged to the US dollar. For a decade, it worked. Inflation calmed. The economy stabilized. People began to believe. Then in 2001, reality struck. Argentina couldn't maintain the dollar peg. The government froze bank accounts, limiting withdrawals to $250 per week. Overnight, people's life savings were trapped. Protests erupted. The government collapsed, and the peso crashed, losing 2/3 of its value in months. The cycle continues to this day. In 2018, inflation hit 50%. In 2019, it exceeded 50% again. By 2023, it was approaching 150%. Each generation of Argentines learns the same lesson their parents and grandparents learned: your government will promise stability and deliver ruin. But here's what makes Argentina's tragedy so instructive. Throughout every collapse, certain people endured. They were the ones who converted pesos to dollars whenever possible. Who bought property instead of trusting banks? Who kept assets outside the Argentine banking system? Who understood that in a country that destroys its currency every generation, the only safety is diversification? The rest, the teachers, the workers, the middle class who trusted their government's promises, watched their life's work evaporate again and again and again. Argentina proves that collapse isn't ancient history. It's the present. And it shows that without structural change, without limits on money printing, without consequences for monetary betrayal, the cycle never ends. Venezuela, when oil couldn't save you. In the early 2000s, Venezuela should have been one of the wealthiest nations on earth. It possessed the world's largest proven oil reserves, larger than Saudi Arabia, larger than Russia. Enough oil to power prosperity for generations. Instead, Venezuela became a humanitarian catastrophe, a modern-day illustration of how governments can transform abundance into starvation through monetary destruction. The collapse began with promises. The Venezuelan government, flush with oil revenue, promised free health care, free education, subsidized food, and guaranteed employment. They nationalized industries, controlled prices, and printed money to fund their programs. For a while, it felt like paradise. But production collapsed. When the government seized farms and factories, output plummeted. When they controlled prices below the cost of production, goods disappeared from shelves. When they printed money to cover the gap, inflation began its deadly spiral. By 2018, Venezuela's inflation rate reached 1,000,000%. Not 10%, not 100%. 1,000,000%. A cup of coffee that cost 2,000 bolivars in the morning cost 5,000 by lunch. Salaries became meaningless. A month's wages couldn't buy a dozen eggs. The government's response: print larger bills. They issued 100,000 bolivar notes, then 500,000, then 1,000,000. Each new denomination became worthless before the ink dried. Eventually, they gave up and removed 5 zeros from the currency. Then they did it again. Then again. Meanwhile, people were starving. Not in a metaphorical sense, but actually dying of malnutrition in a country sitting on an ocean of oil. Doctors fled the country. Engineers drove taxis. Teachers sold coffee on street corners. The educated middle class evaporated. But even in Venezuela's nightmare, patterns emerged. The survivors were those who had converted bolivars to dollars or Bitcoin, who had left the country before borders closed, who had family abroad sending remittances, who had skills that could be traded directly for food. The wealthy, those with connections to the government or access to foreign currency, not only survived but profited. They bought assets from desperate families for pennies. They smuggled subsidized goods across borders for profit. They converted collapsing bolivars into real estate and foreign bank accounts. Venezuela's tragedy teaches us something darker than previous examples. Even when a nation has immense natural wealth, even when resources exist to provide for everyone, monetary destruction can still create famine. Because money isn't just a tool for exchange. It's the mechanism that coordinates production and distribution. When you destroy the money, you destroy the ability of society to function. And in that destruction, survival belongs not to the faithful, not to the hardworking, but to those who see collapse coming and position themselves outside the dying system. The patterns that never change. By now, the rhythm should be unmistakable. Spain's silver, Holland's tulips, the Soviet ruble, Argentina's endless cycles, Venezuela's oil-backed poverty. The details differ, but the melody is always the same. Every collapse begins with confidence. The experts assure you the system is sound. The government promises stability. The people believe because the alternative, that everything they've built their lives around could vanish, is too terrifying to accept. Then comes the slow erosion. Prices rise, promises stretch. Trust begins to crack. But most people don't see it because they're living inside the system, using its currency, trusting its institutions, believing its narratives. The break happens faster than anyone expects. One day the banks are open, the next they're not. One day your money buys food, the next it doesn't. One day you have a future. The next you're standing in line with millions of others, all asking the same question: how did we not see this coming? And finally, the transfer. Wealth doesn't disappear and collapse. It moves. From those who trusted paper to those who held production. From those who believed promises to those who owned assets. From the many who were faithful to the few who were skeptical. This is the part that makes collapse both tragedy and opportunity. For every family destroyed, there's someone who prepared. For every savings account wiped out, there's an asset purchased at fire sale prices. History is brutal in its honesty. Collapse rewards awareness and punishes blind faith. But here's what makes the current moment different from every previous example. For the first time in history, the entire global system is built on the same foundation. The world's reserve currency, the US dollar, is no longer backed by gold or silver or anything tangible. It's backed by faith in the US government's ability to repay debts that are mathematically impossible to repay. Every empire that created money from nothing learned the same lesson. Spain with its American silver, France with its assignats, the Confederacy with its graybacks, the Weimar Republic with its marks, Zimbabwe with its trillions, Venezuela with its bolivars. The pattern never changes. And now, the United States, Europe, Japan, and China are all running the same experiment simultaneously, printing money to fund deficits, creating currency to buy assets, inflating away debts they can't repay. The numbers are bigger, the technology is more sophisticated, but the fundamentals haven't changed. Governments still can't resist the temptation to print. Institutions still fail despite promises of too big to fail. Currencies still collapse when trust evaporates. And survival still belongs to those who recognize the patterns before they become obvious. How collapse happens today. The difference between ancient collapse and modern collapse is speed and scale. When the Byzantine solidus degraded, it took decades. When the Spanish Empire fell, it took generations. But in our interconnected, digital world, collapse can happen in hours. In 2008, Lehman Brothers was a global financial giant. Then it wasn't. In 2013, Cyprus froze bank accounts overnight. In 2015, Greece imposed capital controls. In 2019, Lebanon's banks stopped allowing withdrawals. In 2022, 3 major U.S. banks collapsed in a single week. The pattern is accelerating because money itself has become abstract. It's numbers on screens, entries in databases, promises in code. When trust breaks, there's nothing physical to slow the fall. Just clicking a button can trigger a bank run that destroys an institution in minutes. This creates both danger and clarity. The danger is that when collapse comes, it will be faster and more complete than any historical precedent. No time to react. No space to adjust. Just a sudden, brutal reset. The clarity is that the warning signs are visible if you know what to watch for. Governments running deficits they can't sustain. Central banks creating money to buy government debt. Asset prices disconnected from productive value. Debt levels that require infinite growth to service. These aren't predictions. They're measurements. What actually survives? Every collapse in history has taught the same lessons, but people refuse to learn them until it's too late. So here they are, written in the ruins of empires. Productive assets outlast currency. Land that grows food. Factories that make goods. Skills that create value. These survive when money dies because human needs don't change. People still need to eat, build, and trade regardless of what's printed on paper. Diversification is defense. Every person who held all their wealth in Confederate dollars learned this lesson too late. Every Venezuelan who kept all their savings in bolivars learned it too late. The survivors held multiple forms of value across multiple systems. Debt in dying currency destroys you. From the Asian financial crisis to Argentina's defaults, borrowing in someone else's money is a trap that closes when crisis hits. Your income collapses while your debt stays fixed in a currency that's appreciating or that you can't access. Institutions serve themselves, not you. From Renaissance Florence to modern Lebanon, banks have frozen accounts, seized deposits, and betrayed customers to save themselves. Your money in their system is really their asset and your promise. Timing matters more than amount. Moving 50% of your wealth out of a dying system 6 months early saves you. Moving 100% of your wealth one day late destroys you. The difference between survival and ruin is often just recognizing the pattern slightly sooner than the crowd. Skills are the ultimate currency. When money fails, production doesn't. The baker still has bread. The doctor still has knowledge. The craftsman still has ability. These can be traded directly when currency becomes worthless. But perhaps the most important lesson is this: collapse is not an ending. It's a reset. And resets always benefit those who understand what's happening. The uncomfortable truth about opportunity. This is the part most people don't want to hear. Collapse creates winners. Every financial disaster in history has minted a new elite while destroying an old one. It's not random. It's not luck. It's the deliberate result of seeing patterns others miss and acting before those patterns become obvious. After the Black Death, laborers became landowners. After Spain's collapse, Dutch merchants built an empire. After the Soviet fall, oligarchs seized industries. After 2008, those with liquidity bought assets at Depression-era prices. The transfer is always the same, from paper to production, from promises to property, from the trusting to the prepared. And it happens because collapse creates a moment when everything real becomes artificially cheap in the chaos. This is why studying historical collapse isn't just defensive, it's offensive. Because if you understand the pattern, you can position yourself not just to survive, but to acquire. When currencies fail, productive assets go on sale. When banks collapse, real businesses can be bought for fractions of their value. When populations panic, those with clarity and resources can build empires. This isn't exploitation, it's recognizing reality. The wealth doesn't disappear. It transfers, and it will transfer to someone. The question is whether you'll be part of the transfer or a victim of it. Where we stand today. Look around. The United States government adds $1 trillion to its debt every 100 days. Interest payments on that debt now exceed defense spending. The Federal Reserve creates money to buy government bonds while insisting there's no inflation problem even as prices soar. Europe faces energy crises, demographic collapse, and debt levels that require permanent monetary expansion. Japan has been printing money for 3 decades, achieving nothing but zombie banks and stagnant growth. China has built ghost cities and mountains of debt while controlling its currency to maintain the illusion of stability. Every major economy is running the same playbook that destroyed every empire in history: print money. Debase currency. Promise stability while delivering inflation. Insist this time is different. But history doesn't care about modern monetary theory or digital currencies or any other narrative we tell ourselves. The fundamentals haven't changed. When you create money faster than you create value, that money loses worth. When you promise more than you can deliver, those promises break. When you sacrifice tomorrow to pay for today, tomorrow always arrives. The signs are everywhere if you choose to see them. This isn't prophecy. It's pattern recognition. The choice you have to make. So here we are. You've read about Spanish silver and Dutch tulips, about Soviet rubles and Argentine pesos, about Venezuelan bolivars and Lebanese pounds. You've seen the pattern repeated across centuries and continents. You understand that collapse isn't an aberration. It's the norm. Now comes the question that matters. What will you do with that knowledge? Most people will do nothing. They'll read this, feel a moment of concern, then return to the comfortable illusion that their system is different, their money is safe, their future is secure. They'll trust the experts who have never predicted a collapse in time to prevent one. They'll believe the promises of institutions that have broken those promises throughout history. And when the collapse comes, not if, but when, they'll be the ones standing in line outside banks that won't open, holding currency that won't buy bread, asking how no one saw this coming. But a smaller group will recognize the truth. They'll understand that every empire swears its money is safe right up until the moment it isn't. They'll diversify their wealth across systems. They'll build skills that create value independent of currency. They'll position themselves to survive the chaos and seize the opportunity. They'll be labeled pessimists, doomsayers, paranoid, right up until the moment they're proven right. Because here's the final truth history teaches. You can't stop collapse. These forces are too large, too entrenched, too dependent on the very mechanisms that guarantee their eventual failure. What you can do is choose which side of the transfer you'll be on. Will you hold paper or production, promises or property, faith or foresight? History has already shown you what works and what fails. The empires have risen and fallen. The currencies have inflated and collapsed. The patterns have repeated so many times that ignoring them is a choice, not an accident. Every crisis transfers wealth from the many who believed to the few who prepared. From those who trusted to those who doubted. From those who hoped the system would save them to those who understood that systems only save themselves. The question isn't whether the next collapse is coming. History guarantees it is. The question is whether you'll see it before everyone else does, whether you'll act while action still matters, and whether you'll emerge from the chaos not as a victim, but as one of the few who understood that in every collapse, there are only two types of people. Those who lose everything, and those who recognize that the game was always rigged to end this way. So which will you be? Because the clock is ticking. The debt is mounting. The money is printing. And somewhere in the background, history is clearing its throat, preparing to teach the same lesson it's taught 1,000 times before. The only question is whether this time you'll be listening. If you enjoyed learning how history and money intertwine, subscribe to our channel for more untold stories of wealth, collapse, and survival.